The entertainment chamber aboard the warship Heavenly Hook hummed with the sounds of youthful alien warriors sharing stories during their rest cycle. Their radiant scales flickered under the soft blue lighting as they lounged on comfort cushions, enjoying a brief respite from their duties. "Did you hear?" said First Scout Smith, his antennae twitching with amusement. "These humans actually believe they can fight without all their limbs. Can you imagine something so ridiculous?" Laughter rippled through the group. Their bodies were perfectly designed for battle, with reinforced exoskeletons and redundant organ systems, making such claims seem absurd. Commander Ree clicked his mandibles in mockery. "That's nothing. Just yesterday, I was reading their historical records. They have tales of heroes fighting for days without rest, as if any organic being could maintain combat effectiveness without proper recovery." In the corner of the chamber, Commander Dim sat quietly, his weathered exoskeleton bearing the marks of countless battles. Deep notches and poorly healed cracks told stories of their own, yet he remained silent as the youthful warriors continued their banter. "My favorite," trilled Medical Officer Stone, "is their claim about something they call adrenaline, allowing them to lift vehicles to save their young. Pure fantasy. The mechanical force required would shatter their fragile calcium-based skeletal structure." The younger aliens shared another round of clicking laughter, their bodies vibrating with merriment. They were the pride of the Cosmic Defense Force, each genetically enhanced and cybernetically optimized for combat. The idea that soft-bodied humans could rival their abilities seemed laughable. "Did you know," added Engineer Rock, waving his upper appendages enthusiastically, "they don't even have redundant organs? Just one heart and 2 lungs. If they lose them, that's it. How could they even reach space?" Commander Dim shifted slightly, his weary hand unconsciously brushing against the synthetic replacement for his lower right limb. The movement caught Medical Officer Stone's attention. "Commander, you've been unusually quiet. Surely you find these human fantasies as amusing as we do." The chamber grew still. Dim was a legend among their ranks, having served in over 50 missions. His presence commanded attention. Now, everyone's eyes were on him. Dim's scales shimmered, a sign of deep contemplation among their species. "Legends," he said at last, his voice carrying the gravitas of age, "often contain grains of truth." The youthful warriors exchanged glances. Engineer Rock's antennae drooped slightly, a sign of confusion. "But Commander, you can't possibly believe what I believe," Dim interrupted. "It's based on experience, not records or secondhand stories." He straightened to his full height, impressive even among their tall species. "You mock what you don't understand, and that's dangerous for fighters." First Scout Smith leaned forward, curiosity eclipsing his earlier amusement. "Commander, have you really fought humans?" This time, the veteran's scales glimmered, and the younger aliens noticed something they hadn't before: a slight tremor in his movements when the subject of humans arose. Was it fear? Dim's voice lowered, compelling them to lean in. "Yes, I've fought humans, and I'll tell you something, young ones. There's a reason we pursue peace treaties with them now. There's a reason our leadership strictly enforces those agreements." The entertainment chamber fell so quiet that the hum of the ship's engine seemed loud in comparison. The earlier jokes felt suddenly juvenile as they watched their esteemed commander's reaction. "Would you enlighten us, sir?" Medical Officer Stone asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Commander Dim looked at each of them, his compound eyes reflecting the blue light. The youthful warriors felt the weight of his gaze, heavy with experiences they couldn't fathom. "Perhaps it's time you learned the truth about humans," he said finally. "But I warn you, after this, you won't find their abilities amusing any longer." The youthful aliens gathered closer, their previous laughter forgotten, as Commander Dim prepared to share his story. None of them realized that their understanding of combat and their place in the cosmos was about to change forever. Dim's scales shimmered as he began his tale, his voice carrying the weight of memories he would rather forget. "It was 30 cycles ago during the expansion wars. My unit was considered elite, the best of the best. We had never failed a mission, never lost a battle. Our bodies were perfectly engineered for combat, and we knew it. Pride was our first mistake." The young warriors listened intently as their commander continued. "We received orders to investigate a small human research station on the outer rim. Intelligence suggested it was lightly defended, just a handful of scientists with basic security. Our mission was straightforward: capture their technology and any survivors for study. We thought it would be easy." Dim's lower limbs shifted awkwardly. There were 12 of us descending from orbit in stealth units. The human facility sat in a clearing surrounded by dense vegetation. They had basic perimeter sensors, but nothing that could detect our advanced cloaking technology. We observed them for 3 days. He paused, his compound eyes darkening slightly. They seemed so soft-skinned, like delicate creatures going about their work with no armor, no reinforced organs, no enhanced strength modifications. We watched them eating, sleeping, and working. What a wasteful species, we thought. How wrong we were. The entertainment chamber remained silent as Dim pressed on. On the 4th day, we launched our assault at dawn. Everything went perfectly at first. We penetrated their perimeter without triggering any alarms. Our first objective was their communications array. One precise shot, and they were cut off from help. But then, Dim's voice grew tenser. We encountered our first human defender, a lone guard caught in the open by 3 of our fighters. They shot him clean hits right through his torso. By all logic, he should have fallen immediately. The young soldiers leaned in, their previous laughter forgotten. But this human, with holes in his body that would have killed any of us instantly, raised his weapon and fired back. He killed 2 of our warriors before the 3rd could finish him off. We lost 2 elite fighters to what should have been a dead man. Medical Officer Stone's antennae twitched in disbelief. But that's impossible. With wounds like that, the blood loss alone is unimaginable. Dim interrupted. We thought so too, but that was just the beginning. The gunfire had alerted the facility, just as we expected. Panic ensued, but instead of chaos, we faced organized resistance. These scientists, these supposedly delicate researchers, moved like trained soldiers. They had hidden weapons caches throughout the facility. Combat armor appeared from behind false panels. These weren't just scientists, they were military personnel disguised as researchers. But that wasn't what shocked us most, Dim continued, his scarred hand tracing the synthetic replacement for his lower right appendage. We shot them over and over, and they kept fighting. One human took a plasma bolt to the arm. The limb was practically disintegrated. She cauterized the wound with a hot piece of metal and kept firing with her remaining arm. The young aliens shifted uncomfortably as their commander pressed on. Another human had his leg shattered by our heavy weapons. He dragged himself to a defensive position and held it for 20 minutes, taking down 3 more of our fighters before bleeding out. We had never seen anything like it. By the time we secured part of the facility, we had lost 7 of our 12-member team, 7 elite fighters against what we thought were mere researchers. Dim's voice trailed off. Then what, Commander? First, Scout Smith murmured. Then we met their security chief, a human male who would teach me the true meaning of fear. But that's the next part of the story. Dim fell silent, his gaze distant. The young soldiers looked at one another, their earlier confidence shaken. The human myths they had laughed at before didn't seem so amusing anymore. Would you like to hear what happened next? Dim asked, his voice steady. The entertainment chamber filled with eager gestures, even as a subtle tremor coursed through their bodies. They were about to learn why their commander, one of the most decorated veterans in their ranks, still bore the scars, both physical and mental, of his encounters with humanity. Grace's voice grew softer as he continued his story, making the young soldiers lean in closer after the initial chaos at the facility. Their security chief escaped into the surrounding forest. We could have retreated. We'd already lost more than half our unit, but pride and anger clouded our judgment. We decided to hunt him down. Commander Gray's outer membranes rippled with remembered tension. There were 5 of us left. Still confident in our superior tracking abilities, we followed his blood trail through the dense vegetation. The human was badly wounded. We hit him at least 3 times during the facility breach. The forest was dark with 3 moons casting shifting shadows through the canopy. Our enhanced vision gave us perfect clarity, and we could smell his blood in the air. It should have been an easy track and eliminate mission. The commander's scarred hands clenched the first trap, taking out Walker, a simple cord across the path, primitive technology, but when Walker tripped, it sharpened. Stakes swung down from the trees straight through his armor's weak points. The human had set it up while bleeding out, calculating exactly where we'd step. Medical Officer Stone's antenna twitched nervously, but how could he think so clearly with such severe injuries? That's what we couldn't understand, Gray continued. The blood trail showed he was losing fluids rapidly. By our medical knowledge, he should have been unconscious, if not dead. Instead, he was thinking, planning, and using the forest against us. We moved more cautiously after that, but it didn't help. The human had scattered false blood. Trails, we split up to cover more ground. Another mistake. Officer Jones found a trail and radio. He was closing in. Those were his last words. The young soldier sat and raptly listened as Gray described the scene. We found Jones's body 10 minutes later. The human had waited in a tree, dropping down on him from above in hand-to-hand combat, something we thought humans would be too weak for. Jones's neck was broken, his armor pierced at the joints with a crude knife made from a broken piece of metal. 3 of us left. Now the forest seemed alive with danger. Every shadow could hide death. The human was no longer prey. He had turned the hunt around. We were being stalked. Gray's compound eyes dimmed with the memory. Captain Miller died next to another trap, this time a pit covered with vegetation. But not just a pit. The bottom was filled with sharp stakes, and Miller's impellant triggered an explosion. The human had somehow rigged one of our own plasma grenades that he'd taken from Jones, just me and Lieutenant Green. Now we could hear sounds in the forest, deliberately made sounds. The human was toying with us. Drive us deeper into his killing ground, Green snapped. He started firing randomly into the trees, screaming about demons and monsters. The commander's voice grew even quieter. The shot that killed Green came from behind us. Somehow the human had circled around, one bullet in perfect placement at the base of Green's skull, right where our armor is thinnest. I spun around, but the human was already gone, melting back into the shadows. I was alone now. The elite unit that had started this hunt was reduced to a single survivor, and then I heard it, a sound that still haunts my sleep cycles. Human laughter echoing through the trees. The young soldiers unconsciously huddled closer together as Gray described the final moments of the hunt. The human's voice called out to me. His words were calm and controlled, showing no sign of the pain he must have been feeling. He said, "You wanted to learn about humans. The lesson's not over yet." Gray paused his scared hand again, touching his synthetic limb. "Would you like to hear what happened when I finally faced him? How I survived when the others didn't?" The recreation chamber was silent except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. The young aliens nodded their ears. Earlier bravado was completely forgotten, replaced by a growing understanding of why their commander treated human capabilities with such respect. "Very well," Gray said, "but remember what comes next is why we have peace treaties now, why we never ever want humans as enemies again." Commander Gray's antenna trembled slightly. As he prepared to continue his story, the young soldiers noticed his outer membranes had taken on a paler shade, a sign of deep emotional stress in their species. "I did something then that none of our kind had ever done in combat," Gray said. "I tried to talk to him to understand. I asked him how he could still fight with such severe wounds." His answer changed everything I thought I knew about humans. The commander's voice took on a clinical tone. He explained that humans evolved from pursuit predators. Their ancestors would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. This gave them something unique, an ability to ignore their bodies' need to stop. But that wasn't all. Gray continued. The human told me about something called the fight or flight response. When humans face danger, their bodies undergo a complete transformation. Their blood vessels constrict to reduce bleeding. Their pain receptors shut down. Their muscles receive more oxygen. They become something else entirely. Medical Officer Stone's professional interest was clearly piqued. "But Commander, that kind of biological response should be impossible to maintain. The energy cost alone is impossible." Gray clicked his mandibles in a harsh laugh. "Look at me, young one. Look at my scars. Look at my synthetic limb. I learned that day that impossible means something very different to humans." The human explained that their bodies produce chemicals, adrenaline and endorphins and cortisol, that can push them far beyond their normal limitations, and the more desperate the situation, the stronger these chemicals become. First, Scout Smith's antenna drooped in confusion. "But wouldn't that burn out their systems and cause complete organ failure?" "Yes," they nodded it, "and they do it anyway. That's what makes them so terrifying. A human backed into a corner doesn't become weaker. They become stronger and more dangerous. Their bodies literally trade their future survival for present combat effectiveness." The commander's voice grew heavy with remembered awe and fear. He told me how human mothers have lifted vehicles weighing tons to save their young, how human soldiers have continued fighting with mortal wounds, their bodies literally being held together by nothing but sheer willpower and these chemicals. But the most frightening part, Gray's outer membranes flickered rapidly. They can't fully control this response. It's automatic, instinctive. A human doesn't choose to ignore pain or fight beyond their limits. Their body simply does it. It's encoded in their very DNA, a legacy of their evolution as persistence. Hunters, the young soldiers, sat in stunned silence as their commander continued. That's why our initial attack went so wrong. We thought we were facing soft scientists. Instead, we faced creatures whose bodies automatically transformed into combat machines when threatened. Every injury, every setback just triggered more of these chemical changes, making them more dangerous. The human laughed when he told me this. He said, "Your kind evolved to be perfect soldiers. We evolved to never stop fighting, no matter what. Which do you think is more dangerous, engineer?" Rock's voice was barely a whisper. "Is that why High Command enforces the PE treaties so strictly?" "Yes," Gray nodded solemnly, "because we discovered that humans don't just fight until they win. They fight until they physically cannot fight anymore, and that point is far, far beyond what any rational species would consider possible." The commander's compound eyes swept across his audience. "Would you like to hear what happened next? How this conversation ended in a confrontation that cost me my limb and nearly my life?" The young soldiers nodded. Their earlier mockery of human capabilities was now completely forgotten. They understood now why their commander had remained silent during their jokes. He hadn't been amused. He had been remembering terrors they couldn't imagine very well, Gray said, his voice growing tight with tension. "But remember, what I'm about to tell you is why every combat manual now lists humans as extreme threat entities to be engaged only as an absolute last resort, Commander." Gray's voice grew hoarse as he continued his tale. The recreation chamber's blue lighting seemed to dim, matching the gravity of his words. "After our conversation in the forest, I thought I understood humans better. I was wrong. Understanding their biology didn't prepare me for what came next." The commander's scarred hands trembled slightly. The human emerged from the shadows. "Even now, I remember every detail. His uniform was soaked with blood, 3 plasma. Burns marked his body. His left arm hung useless at his side. By any rational standard, he should have been dead, but his eyes, Gray's outer membranes, shuddered. They weren't the eyes of a dying creature. They burned with something I'd never seen before. Not rage, not fear, but pure, unrelenting determination. He moved like his wounds didn't exist. Our medical scans later showed he had a punctured lung, severe internal bleeding, and multiple fractures, yet he moved with deadly precision. I raised my weapon, but he was faster. The young soldiers leaned forward as Gray continued. The first shot took my lower right limb clean, hitting right at the joint. I fell, but my combat training kicked in. I rolled, returned fire, and hit him twice more center mass, the kind of hits that would drop any of us in instantly. He didn't even flinch. Gray's voice carried a note of lingering disbelief. It just kept coming. I managed to get behind a fallen tree and called for emergency extraction, but he was always one step ahead. The human had circled around while I was distracted. He dropped from above just like with Jones, but I was ready. We fought hand to hand, my 3 remaining limbs against his 1 good arm and sheer will. Commander Gray touched his scarred face. "That's when I learned another terrifying truth about humans. Their bones don't break clean like ours, they splinter. When the human struck me, his broken arm should have been useless. Instead, the jagged bone edges became weapons." The young aliens unconsciously touched their own smooth exoskeletons as Gray continued. He was dying. Every movement cost him blood. He couldn't spare, but his eyes never changed, that same burning determination, no fear, no hesitation, just the absolute certainty that he would complete his mission or die trying. I managed to land what should have been a killing blow, pierced straight through his remaining good shoulder with my blade arm. "Do you know what he did?" Gray asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. The soldiers shook their heads, entranced by the tale. He grabbed my blade AR arm with his impaled shoulder, locking me in place, used his broken arm to strike again, and again, those splintered bones tearing through my armor. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't break free. His grip was like industrial steel. That's when my emergency extraction team arrived. The human heard the ships coming. "You know what he said to me? He said, remember this, remember what happens when you cornered humans." Gray's outer membrane split further. The extraction team had to pry his dead fingers off my arm. Even in death, his grip didn't loosen. The medics said his muscles had locked up, his last action preserved by his body's final surge of chemicals. The commander looked at each young soldier in turn. The human died there in that forest, but he achieved his mission. The facility's core data was completely wiped, half of our Eli unit dead, the rest of us wounded or traumatized, all because we underestimated what humans are capable of. "Would you like to hear what we learned later?" Gray asked. "About why humans are the way they are. about the evolutionary pressures that created such terrifying capabilities. The young soldiers nodded, their earlier bravado completely forgotten. They understood now that they weren't just hearing a war story. They were learning why their entire military doctrine had changed after first contact with humans. Very well, Gray said, but remember what I'm about to tell you is why we now train our soldiers to avoid pushing humans to their breaking point. Because when humans break, they don't collapse, they transform into something nightmarish. Commander Gray's compound eyes reflected the dim light as he began explaining the deeper implications of his encounter after that mission. Our scientists became obsessed with understanding humans. They studied their history, their evolution, and their biology. What they discovered terrified our high command. The commander pulled up a holographic display showing the human evolutionary path. Most species evolved to either fight or flee from danger, but humans evolved to do both, and more importantly, to keep doing it long past the point where other species would give up. Their ancestors weren't the strongest or fastest. Instead, they survived through sheer persistence. They would chase prey under the hot sun for days, following tracks, never stopping until their target collapsed from exhaustion. This gave them something unique in the galaxy, the ability to override their body's survival instincts. Medical Officer Stone's antenna twitched. But Commander, how did this make them such dangerous warriors? Because Gray explained, these same traits that let them chase prey for days also let them fight. Beyond normal biological limits, their bodies developed systems to keep functioning despite severe injuries, extreme exhaustion, or overwhelming stress. The holographic display shifted to show human internal biology. Look at their redundant systems. If their liver is damaged, other organs can take over some functions. If they lose blood, their bodies are automatically redirected to vital organs. Their bones can repair them. Elves often become stronger at the break points, but the most frightening part is their brain chemistry. Gray continued, humans developed something called the runner's high, a reward system that releases pleasure chemicals during prolonged physical stress. This same system activates during combat first. Scout Smith's mandibles clicked in disbelief. They enjoy fighting, not exactly great, but their bodies reward them for pushing through pain and exhaustion. The harder they push, the more these chemicals flow. It's a feedback loop that can keep them going far beyond what should be possible. The commander's voice grew grave. Our scientists discovered that human combat capabilities actually increase under severe stress. Their visual processing speeds up, their strength multiplies, their pain tolerance becomes almost unlimited, and they enter what they call hyperfocus or combat flow. Most species, Gray explained, become less effective as they tire or take damage. Humans become more dangerous with every injury. Every setback triggers more of these survival chemicals. They literally evolve into better warriors. In the middle of a fight, the young soldiers shifted uncomfortably as their commander continued. There's a human phrase. Fight like a cornered animal, but even that doesn't capture it. The cornered animal will eventually submit when it knows it's beaten. Humans have evolved past that instinct. They'll fight until their bodies physically shut down. This is why our combat doctrine changed. Gray said, deactivating the holographic display, we discovered that traditional military tactics don't work against humans. The more you hurt them, the harder they fight. The more you corner them, the more dangerous they become. Rock's voice quavered. Is this why we have the non-engagement protocols exactly? Gray nodded. Our high command realized that any conflict with humans would become a war of attrition, and while we might win individual battles, through superior technology, war numbers would never stop. They would keep fighting, keep adapting, keep coming back until either they won or were completely exterminated. The commander's outer membranes flickered with remembered pain from a human who merely killed me. Our medical analysis showed that he had enough combat chemicals in his system to kill most species. By themselves, his body was literally burning itself up to keep fighting. And this wasn't unusual for them. It was a natural response encoded in their DNA. Gray looked at his young soldiers with grave intensity. Would you like to hear why we now maintain peace with humans at almost any cost? Why our entire military strategy shifted after we understood what we were dealing with. The recreation chamber was silent as the young aliens nodded, their earlier mockery of human capabilities now replaced with a growing sense of dread. Very well, Gray said, but remember, what I'm about to tell you is why we now consider humans to be one of the most dangerous species in the known galaxy, not despite their biological limitations, but because of them. Commander Gray rose to his full height, his scarred form casting a long shadow in the recreation chamber's dim light. The peace treaties we have with humans aren't just political documents, he began. They're survival strategies. After studying my encounter and others like it, our military analysts came to a frightening conclusion. You see, we thought our superior biology made us perfect warriors. Multiple hearts, redundant organs, enhanced strength, and regenerative capabilities, but humans' Grey's outer membranes flickered rapidly. Humans showed us that being a perfect warrior isn't about having the best biological systems. It's about never stopping, no matter what. Our high command ran simulations of full-scale war with humans. The results were disturbing. The commander's voice grew heavy. We would win the first battles, maybe even the first few campaigns, but humans, they would study every defeat at AP improve, and they would never ever stop. First Scout Smiths and Tenny drooped. But surely our superior technology would mean nothing in the long run. Grey interrupted, because humans have another trait we didn't understand at first. They learn from failure. Every defeat makes them stronger, more determined. Where other species see failure as a sign to retreat, humans see it as a lesson. The analysts found that humans have something they call spite. Grey continued, it's an emotional response that makes them fight harder. When they're losing, they'll sacrifice everything, their resources, their bodies, their lives, just to prove their opponent wrong. The commander activated another holographic display showing statistics from various human conflicts. Look at their history. Every time a technologically superior force thought they had defeated humans, the humans came back, act stronger. They don't accept defeat, they just change tactics and keep fighting. That's why our peace treaties are so strictly enforced, Grey explained, because we realized that any conflict with humans would only end one of two ways. Either they would win or both sides would be destroyed. There is no middle ground with them. Medical Officer Stone's professional curiosity got the better of him. But Commander, surely their biological limitations are their greatest strength. Grey cut in, because they evolved knowing they had these limitations. It made them innovative and ruthless when necessary, and most importantly, it made them value cooperation over individual prowess. The commander's voice took on a tone of grim admiration. Humans don't fight as individuals, they fight as groups, compensating for each other's weaknesses. When one falls, another steps up. They call it leaving no one behind. It makes them exponentially more dangerous than their individual capabilities would suggest. The final analysis was clear. Grey continued, any species that pushes humans too far will face an enemy that doesn't recognize surrender, doesn't accept defeat, and will sacrifice everything to win. An enemy that gets stronger with every setback and more determined with every loss. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence as their commander delivered his final warning. So remember this, all of you. When you're out there on patrol, when you're dealing with human ships or colonies, remember what I told you. Treat them with respect, follow the protocols, because if we ever break the peace treaties, if we ever push them into another war, Grey's compound eyes dimmed, we won't be fighting the soft creatures you mocked earlier. We'll be fighting an enemy that evolution has specifically designed to never give up, never stop, and never accept defeat, an enemy that becomes more dangerous the harder you fight them. The commander looked at each young soldier in turn. Do you understand now? Do you see why your jokes about human capabilities weren't funny to those of us who have faced them in combat? Young aliens nodded solemnly. Their earlier bravado was completely forgotten. They understood now that they had been mocking something they didn't comprehend, and that their ignorance could have been fatal in the wrong circumstances. Good, Grey said quietly, because the most important lesson I learned that day in the forest wasn't about human biology or combat capabilities. It was this. In all the galaxy, there is nothing more dangerous than a species that refuses to know when it's beaten. The recreation chamber fell silent as the young soldiers absorbed this final chilling truth about their former enemies and current uneasy allies, the humans who had taught their entire species the true meaning of persistence.